Welcome to An Unconventional Life, a podcast where we share stories about the crazy 1% out there who earned their doctoral degrees and then went on to use them in crazy, cool, unique, and unconventional ways. Here's your host, astrophysicist turned teacher, author, dissertation coach, and more, Dr. Russell Strickland.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Strickland, the founder and CEO of Dissertation Done, and welcome to An Unconventional Life. Today, we have with us Dr. Rachel Herz. She has a Ph.D. in psychology, but now works as a neuroscientist. She's the world's leading expert on the psychological sense of smell. She's been conducting research on the senses, emotion, perception, and motivated behavior and cognition since 1990. She's a TEDx speaker. She's published over 95 original research papers. She has 3 popular science books. And as she just told me recently, she has another one that's percolating / in the works. It's gone beyond the thinking stages, and hopefully we'll be able to hear more about that and see that soon. Her name again is Dr. Rachel Herz. Dr. Herz, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, that's awesome. I'd like to let everyone know that today's episode is being brought to you by Dissertation Done. At Dissertation Done, we help adult doctoral students through the dissertation process. So if you are feeling a little bit slowed, stalled, or just plain stuck on the process, reach out to us at dissertationdone.com/done, and we'll see if we can schedule a conversation and maybe help you get that dissertation on the fast track to graduation. Now, if you have gone past that point and your first name is already doctor, but you'd like to get your work out there, you have a message you'd like to share, people that you'd like to help, the best way to get the word out there is by being a published author. When your first name's doctor and you literally wrote the book on your area of expertise, you obviously become the default go-to standard for the person who someone would be looking for to help them if they need help in your area. We help folks to get their first books published, and we can have a conversation about that if you go find us at dissertationdone.com/book. So that's the commercial. Again, Dr. Herz, welcome and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned to you before, I often start off by asking folks to tell me a little bit about what motivated you to take this crazy leap into the doctoral journey. You know, there's about 2% of the population ever tries, I guess, about 1% successful. And here we are, the crazy ones. What was your motivation for doing that?
Well, my motivation was almost not my choice because both my parents are professors and I'm the firstborn. So it's like you're going into the family business. That was kind of a given from day one.
What you want to be a professor of, we'll give you full choice, right?
Exactly. Well, actually, not even. My dad was a mathematician. I started off in biology. When I switched to psychology, he told me it was the worst mistake of my life. But,
oh my gosh, that was a bridge too far already.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway,
you mentioned the antique French literature. You didn't mention that you were interested in that at all?
Well, interestingly, my mother is an English professor, English literature, but she's much more easygoing with my, whatever I was interested in. But so I felt like, I in a way, I didn't have much choice in a sense. I mean, I thought this was never really a question of what I was going to do after being an undergraduate and then going on to graduate school, although I did take a year off. And this was before the gap year was a popular thing to do. That was already kind of looked at as askance by my father in particular. But I did, what sort of people tend to do more frequently these days is I actually worked in a lab for half of that year. And then I traveled on the total shoestring, like literally, the sort of stick with the bundle over my back. Spending as little money as possible, traveled through the Middle East and Europe and so forth for 6 months. And during that year, what I had done was I had applied to various graduate schools because because this was going into the family business, I still sort of didn't really know what I was doing with myself. And at the time, and this was also, I'm Canadian, so this was in Canada, and there's not that many schools to choose from, which is sort of good because it limits how many applications you send out. Right. So I sent out about 10. I think that basically accounts for all the Ph.D. programs in Canada, at least at the time. Half of them into clinical psychology programs because I didn't know maybe I want to be a therapist, and then the other half into experimental psychology programs. And I should say something else that happened during that year where I was working in the lab. And this was also something that was really formative in terms of where and what I thought I wanted to do in terms of research. is that, as I just mentioned, I had started off in biology and switched gradually over the course of my undergraduate into psychology. And even though what I was doing would today be called neuroscience, and at the time was called biopsychology, so I was working with animals, specifically working with rats, and I had done various experiments with them. And I was working this summer with the same professor I'd done my honors thesis with, and I actually was really, really lucky. He was very, very supportive of the whole academic track, and I have 2 publications from my undergraduate time just as a function of his mentorship there. But something which was a little
great way to start out, isn't it? I actually had I went to graduate school, the graduate school I chose, because my advisor, my undergraduate mentor, so to speak, went to that graduate school, and he spoke highly of this. Also an excellent program. But yeah, I had the opportunity to publish. Technically, I guess I was in graduate school by the time it came out, but we published, we wrote, we submitted and everything while I was still an undergrad. That was just such a cool experience to be able to do research and actually have it be professionally accepted. And he was a great mentor too. I didn't like the way people wrote science at the time because it's all very stodgy and academic. And I said, they all seem like they're geniuses, right? Because they write about these things as if it was easy. I said, it's not easy. I'm having a lot of hard time with this stuff. And he's like, we all do. Don't worry about it. And I said, well, I'm going to write about that. And so I started off writing about how, all the little things I tried and all the things, why it didn't work and how we got. And he eventually started gently saying, well, don't you think it's confusing to say we did all of this and then it didn't work? Because somebody might just pick it up and start reading that and then try to replicate it. It's like, oh, okay. Yeah. And little by little, he guided me to the plain, boring, cardboard academic wonk speak, because that's there for a reason. But he kind of guided me to it, and I understand why they do it that way now. So now if somebody asks me, why do I need to write my dissertation that way? I'm like, this is why.
Yeah. So something happened during, and this was an experience that doesn't have to do with writing, but while I was working as the sort of the lab technician, we were doing an experiment with animals. I had 72 rats that I had personally hand trained, and they were super tame, and I could handle them. It was completely great. And in fact, one weekend, if we didn't have to come and feed them on the weekend, because as long as they get water, they're okay. But if their water bottle falls out, they actually, it becomes sort of a really bad situation for them. And so I had to hand feed with a little dropper with sweetened condensed milk, this one little rat, back to health and so forth. Anyway, after this long experiment where then the animals are sacrificed, is the technical term, it turns out that we had no results. Like the effect that we were trying to replicate, which my supervisor had read in some other paper, was supposed to be X, and X completely didn't happen. Yeah. And then he realized that it was because the way we were giving the injections of this one particular drug was through a different mechanism than the people in the paper had. And actually the way we did it would take 20 minutes for the drug to have the effect, but we did the behavioral test right away. And therefore we saw nothing. And I thought, 72 animals died because somebody read a paper incorrectly, and this is just wrong. So I had a real crisis of conscience for doing this kind of experimentation. Like it made sense to me, if this is for a greater good, there's a bigger reason for this. I can justify, that these animals are dying for something, but this was animals dying for nothing. And as a result of that, when I was thinking about what kind of experimental work I wanted to do for my PhD, I didn't want to do anything invasive like that. I did not want to be working with animals where they were going to die in the service of what I was doing. So that also,
I can certainly understand all of that, but what was this something that was clearly just a mistake, or was it a learning opportunity? I mean, was this something where you said, you know what, if we do it this way, it causes this type of reaction. If we do it this other way, we get to see an effect. Maybe that's not a full-blown paper, but at least what used to be called letters to.
But it was absolutely nothing. I mean, it wasn't maybe if we would have known that if we did it this way, we would have seen such and such, but we didn't test to find anything. So just the way that the experiment was set up, the dependent variable showing that whatever was supposed to happen, it was basically a complete zilch. So we didn't have a learning
to definitively say we kind of did it wrong, and people will now know we knew it this way, not this way, because that's learning. That's something that's worth reporting.
Right. I mean, I guess the one thing is it underscored that the speed of action, in terms of a brain effect from the pharmacology is really critical. You can't just assume that it's going to be incorporated into the system in a particular like time. So maybe there was that aspect of learning that was involved, but I would say that was a low level.
I understand.
Positive, you know?
I just like to try to take the positive out wherever I can find it. And,
yeah.
and that's the thing is with science, and I'm telling our students this all the time, there's always something that we learn, and usually it's something worthwhile. Even if you didn't find an effect, if you legitimately tested it, like you said, you guys made a mistake, we'll call it a mistake, but whatever, however you want to characterize it, you guys did something not exactly the way that you intended to do it. Even then, it seems like there's something there. And if you test something, you say there's no effect, that's useful. It's not sexy. It's not the sort of thing you get a professorship over, but it is useful to report.
Right. No, I'm completely for finding null effects. You know, for instance, in replicating phenomenon, actually it isn't really there or something along those lines. And so this did show that changing the method. I mean, I'm also a really strong believer in, I think it was Einstein who said he only ever read methods and results because methods dictate results. And so this really shows it, because we changed one thing about the method, everything else was the same and the results were totally different. So I do think that is valuable learning at kind of a pedagogical level, but not so much from the point of view of myself emotionally. At the time, I felt really disturbed by this, and felt that I couldn't really justify this work because it did, you know, it was something that was very intimate to me in a way, working with these animals, like I said, like handling them and, you know, restoring them back to life after they had been, you know, been starving for 2 days and so on. So I felt that there was a need for me to be able to justify the means to the end. And when I saw this mistake, I felt like, well, it's not that I wouldn't make a mistake like this in the future. I just decided that I didn't want to work with animals in this way. And sort of naively at the time, I thought I wanted to work with animals in like the kind of more cuddly way of just observing them. And so what ended up happening while I was away, calling my parents maybe about once a month. So this is way before cell phones. So I'd find a payphone somewhere and I'd say, what's happening? You know, open up the letters, tell me what the results are. And as it turned out, I did not get accepted into any of the clinical PhD programs.
Wow.
But I did get accepted into, so at the time too, it was harder to get into clinical programs. That's probably maybe still the case today, but I got accepted
Very
into
popular. So yeah, they usually have a lot of applicants to this program.
Yeah. So I got accepted into several of the experimental programs, and one of them was also offering me money. So that was the answer. Very, you know, not very profound thinking at this particular juncture. And this was the University of Toronto, which is a really, really good school. So it was probably actually, from the point of view of the hierarchy of universities in Canada, the best one anyway. So that was all very well and fine. But the person,
they were smart enough to offer you money, so obviously they're smart people, right?
They knew what the lure should be. But interestingly, and the person who I was going to be working with did research on birds, and specifically spatial memory, and it was black-capped chickadees in particular. And so what I was going to be doing, and just also to kind of clarify, in Canada, you have a separate master's thesis, and then you do a PhD. So this would be initially going into it. Anyway, my master's work was on what I developed, this idea of looking at spatial memory in black-capped chickadees. And I literally went into the forest with my professor in the early winter with one of those giant bird net things and like trapped birds like this. And we had to band them on their ankles so that we would be able to release them afterwards. And then if we ever caught one again, we would know it had already been used and therefore we would release it again. Anyway, so this was what I did. And you know, my friends used to tease me because I was always kind of into fashion and into other things as well. And they would say, we cannot see you in your Betsy Johnson dress and high heels running around in the woods in the wintertime in Ontario. But they were actually kind of right, because, and not so much from the fashion perspective, but I realized while I was doing this work that what I had really liked about the animal research I was doing wasn't that I, you know, cuddling little rats, but rather that this was a model for human behavior. And specifically what we were looking at was dopamine and drug addiction, and also as it being a model potentially for schizophrenia. And so that was what I was interested in, not so much working with animals. And so during the dark days of my master's research, where I was just like, oh my God, this is like not floating my boat at all. Like, I mean, I was really unhappy and thinking, what am I going to do with myself? This is not right. And also really feeling, and this is actually something that I can say, probably many of your viewers see this too, is I felt like, you know, all I'm working for, and this is throughout graduate school, is to get that PhD, and then I can be a human being. And I used to think, because I would also living in Toronto and living downtown, and I would walk across the street all the time without looking, cars coming here, there, everywhere. And I think everyone would say, "You're going to get run over. You're going to get run over." And I'd like, as long as I have my PhD first, and the obituary says Dr. Rachel Herz, it's okay. So literally, that I was so focused on that goal. That was just something I would say is a bad way of thinking about it. And maybe also, since most of your viewers are adults, they have a better understanding of life balance and so on. But
well, most of them, the goal, it is a strong goal, but in their case, it's true. It's getting that degree. So the research work is not necessarily critical for a lot of the folks in our audience, because they have to do it. It's a degree requirement, but then they're going to use their degree usually outside of research. So yeah, we're trying to get them to laser focus on what does it take to get to that end point. But the thing that you mentioned earlier reminded me of one of my students when I asked them a few weeks after they defended, it's like, what's the best part of graduating now? You know, what is it? And he said, Dr. Strickland, I got my life back. And I thought that was so profound, because in a way you are very much a different person while you're a student and you're focused and lasered in on this goal. But he felt like he could do the things that were him. This was part of his identity, but it was a part that was overtaking the rest of him while he's in school. So I thought that was rather profound, honestly. I've looked at it differently since he said that.
Yeah, so realizing that I had made this mistake in terms of field and topic and what I was really interested in, I knew that after I finished the master's that I needed to go on and do something else. Yeah. But all I really knew at the time was I was interested in humans and I was interested in this sort of behavior, sort of brain psychology interface. And actually what I thought I wanted to do was sleep research, because one of the things during my undergraduate time, which I was really lucky to have, is probably one of the only places in Canada that actually had real sleep researchers, real sleep lab, and so on. And I had done work with some of those people and really loved it. And I thought, well, this would be great if I could now do sleep research, because it seemed like a perfect intersection between biology and psychology on a lot of levels. So I actually started my PhD work doing sleep research, but because nobody in the department had any sleep research background, I was actually working with a doctor who was also on the faculty in the medical school at the University of Toronto. So I was working at one of the hospitals on my research side of things, and then working with a different professor sort of on the theoretical, more basic literature types of things within the department. And then, because the University of Toronto did not have a clinical program at that time, that I was told after a year of doing this, sorry, we think what you're doing is too clinical. You have to change, because you're working out of a hospital, you have to change your areas or leave. I mean, or if you want to do this, you have to do it somewhere else because you can't do it here. So then I was like, okay, now what do I do? But at this point, I'd also realized, emotion and memory and sort of, again, these kinds of mechanisms were really of interest to me. And I should say, sort of backtracking back to my undergraduate days working in the lab and with that supervisor, while I was there that year, taking that year off and working in the lab and so on, I did the GRE exams. Yep. And one of the questions on the specific subsection for psychology was, what is the sense that's most closely linked to memory? And the answer was smell. And I asked my supervisor, why is that? And he said, oh, well, it just is. I think it has something to do with neuroanatomy, but whatever. Anyhow, that also really stuck in my craw. That's not really a satisfying answer.
No. It's not really a satisfying answer from a behavioral standpoint. It's certainly not a satisfying answer from a scientific standpoint, but from a behavioral standpoint, one of the things we're trying to work with doctoral students on all the time is the words, I don't know. It's okay. Yeah. It's perfectly fine. It's a source of strength to say, I don't know. They taught me in graduate school, you can't say that all the time. You have to know something, but nobody can know everything. So just know what you know what you don't know, and then don't worry about it. What's more interesting is if you can say, we don't know, like, enough to know nobody knows this. Then you're like, okay, let me go find out. But for him to at least say, I don't know, because what he said sounded more like, and I'm trying to remember who did this, but there was a Nobel laureate who was sent a research paper at some point, and the person was just very, interested in hearing his feedback. They wanted to know, what do you think of this paper? And his answer was, this isn't even wrong. that's like such a cut, you know,
Yeah.
like
So obnoxious.
it's not right, it's not wrong, it's not even at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And that's almost what that answer sounded like to me. Like, there's no reason to ask this question. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It just is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, actually, but it did have a very motivating effect on me because that always stuck at the back of my mind of that's not satisfying as an answer. So one of the things also with my PhD program, this is something also in Canadian universities, is there's a lot of coursework and so I was taking, one of the courses I was taking at the time was reading different research papers. And one of them actually, this was about emotion and so forth. One of them, the researchers actually used smell to manipulate mood, and this had never been done before. And they had this little paragraph in the introduction about why they had chosen the sense of smell to do this with, and that it was this primitive sense deeply tied to emotion, and it had these various evolutionarily based connections. And one of the things I really learned very well in my master's research was evolutionary theory. So one of the things I really want to get out as a message is that everything works out, to really make sense in the end. And although a lot of people at the time, professors and so forth, criticized, like actually I found this out, professors have a meeting and they evaluate students and how they're doing. And I was considered, among those least likely to succeed because I was constantly switching areas and doing this and then doing that. But actually everything that I learned along the way moved together to really inform me and lead me to making novel insights and getting me to where I am. And if I hadn't had that, if I would have just been sort of spinning the same wheel all along, I never would have been doing what I do now. So that I actually think is a great strength and opportunity to have all these different areas of background. But anyway, reading this,
as long as you're doing whatever you're doing, as long as you're doing it with intention, that is something that you're interested in somehow and something that motivates you, there is a thread, and you might not recognize it until much later. You might not ever appreciate it yourself, but it creates a strength. It creates a well-rounded person. I mean, my background is quite varied, but I think all of those pieces have gotten me to where I am now, and I appreciate all of them. I wouldn't have said, oh, I wish I could erase that part. No, it helped me in some way, and I think that's always the case. As long as we're not being forced to do something. If you're forced to do something, it might be contrary to what you do, and you might really switch tracks. But otherwise, there is this sort of organic way that things tend to fit together, as long as you just sort of intuitively follow what's interesting to you, it seems.
Yeah, especially if you're looking back on it retrospectively and then making the narrative make sense. But I had learning and memory really very well trained as an undergraduate. Then I had really good evolutionary theory background, and I had, learning all this work about emotion. And then when I read this paper, this light bulb literally went off, and I realized that the way to marry biology and psychology was something that I was really interested in, was to study the sense of smell, in particular, how the connection between smell and emotional memory. And going back to that question that always really bothered me. And I was also really lucky because my supervisor at the time, whose work was completely different, and I had done work in his area, he was a social psychologist, particularly interested in aesthetics, so, art and so on. But he was very open to just sort of the general, so he was a real generalist. And he said, that's fine. If you want to study this, I cannot help you. Here's the rope, go hang yourself. And actually what I did was I went to the US, I went to Brown University, where the father of where the science of smell, psychologically speaking, was being studied was. I learned from him. I went to International Flavors and Fragrances in New Jersey. I got all the materials for my research. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, where there were other researchers that I met with to sort of learn methodology and technique. And the IFF people we still have this joke that they thought, who is this crazy Canadian graduate student who shows up literally on our doorstep? I mean, I called ahead of time, but says like, show me how you do stuff. And like, can you give me some smells? Anyhow, I basically got lucky putting a paradigm together and protocol, and my PhD research was looking at the relationship between smell and emotional memory, and kind of the rest is history. But it was definitely a very bumpy path. And I was told multiple times that, by professors in the department while I was, getting ready to be finished, that, well, you're not going to be able to make a career out of this, really you should do something else, think about something else for your postdoc, this sort of really not supportive of that this was going to be successful. And at some level they were right. The sense of smell is not a big area of draw from the academic world. And at that time too, I just thought all I'm doing is going into academia. I want to be a professor, and that's it. But
When you're saying it's not a big draw, don't they use smells now for recovered memories? Don't they use that in a way to help people remember things?
but not in an academic clinical setting. So there is, I mean, clinically, I think that there is that, but from an academic perspective and from a pure research perspective, I mean, for instance, vision is very highly studied academically, you know, hearing to a certain degree, the other senses less so, and smell is probably the bottom of the barrel. I mean, I'm a co-author on, currently it's the leading sensation perception textbook for college students. And, you know, the chapter on smell and the chapter on taste are at the end. And it's kind of a joke, you know, if you're a professor teaching this, it's like, okay, you know, well, we go through the semester and well, we might or might not get to those chapters at the end.
Yeah.
So it's still considered not very important.
Yeah. Again, it just seems to me like there are, from what I've seen, and I obviously haven't studied this the way you have at all, but it seems like there are applications, and where there are applications, there, you know, the theorists need to catch up in some sense, so that we can help drive those applications even further.
Yeah, well, there is theory there, and there are people working on it, but not nearly the amount of people that work on other senses. And actually, one of the silver linings, I think, to this COVID-19 pandemic is the fact that smell loss is such an important both diagnostic and also has been, unfortunately, for many, a long-term symptom.
Right.
That general public awareness of the sense of smell and the importance of the sense of smell has skyrocketed over the last year. And that's been actually great for me.
Yeah.
It's great for other researchers who work in this area, because now there's real interest, and there's interest both from a basic knowledge perspective, there's interest at an applied level perspective, there's interest at a clinical level. So I think this is a real kind of renaissance moment for the sense of smell. So that's also very.
So how are you taking advantage of this moment? And I don't mean that in the Machiavellian sense, just it's an opportunity. And how are you guys, again, exploit has that negative connotation, but how are you exploiting this moment?
Well, I mean, I've written a lot of papers on the topic and working more on it these days than probably, I mean, so my research, one of the things that, you know, I could talk about briefly as my books being on somewhat different topics show, is that I've moved around, you know, I haven't just stayed focused on smell for my entire career. So that's Disgusting, my second book. My first book was about the sense of smell. And really, at the time also, I should say, I thought I was leaving academia for good. A variety of things had happened, all basically bad. And I thought, okay, this is it, I'm done. But I can't just walk away. I have to have my swan song, you know, I've done all this work. So that was what motivated me for my first book. But my second book, which if you want to hear the story, I'll tell it later about how I got to writing a book called That's Disgusting. But disgust is actually a taste-based emotion. So it's related to the chemical senses as well. And then I realized, well, you know, smell, taste, food, everybody loves to eat, myself especially. And so, you know, my third book being about food and eating, and always taking this kind of biological, psychological interface and kind of weaving them together. But so my research has followed along in those different areas as well. And I have, you know, one of the main ways that I actually earn an income is by consulting. So I do a lot of consulting for companies in smell, taste, and flavor. Also some legal work as an expert witness, because so few people have this kind of expertise. And then I do, you know, collaborations where I may be a consultant on a grant, where I'm working, you know, as the smell expert, as it were. So keeping up research in that regard. But this past year, I'm actually the guest editor for a special issue of a journal called Brain Sciences, and the topic is advances in human olfactory perception. So, you know, getting all the latest research on that and really providing a forum for that. I've also embarked on my own research. I think I was a little bit crazy to do so, since I don't have a lab anymore. I mean, I'm affiliated both with Brown University and Boston College, so I was able to use the data pools from there, or the subject pools from there. But I don't have a lab where I can be, you know, working on things. But I did and not that would really help this year since everything was virtual, but I ended up doing an online study. And I'm really excited about the results of that and working on other papers. So, you know, taking advantage, and actually the book that's percolating is about smell again. So, you know, I'm coming back to my roots. I'm very much more invigorated by it these days. I mean, that's another thing
to take away from this, and what they can easily see from your smile as you talk about all this stuff, is that once you have your degree, there's so many opportunities available for you to kind of choose your path. And people out there might think smell is the most boring thing in the world. That's fine. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do that. You got to choose to do that, and that you enjoy it so much, and it's something that motivates you. And they get to do that too when they finish their degree. They get to choose what lights the fire for them, and that's so cool.
Well, I think the passion is really the key. I mean, that's what I realized while I was doing my master's thesis work, is that the passion was not there. And it's so hard to keep on going when all the difficulty of it is going on and you have everything else, and just to like push yourself through it. And I realized, life is too short. I can't just spend the next 4 or 5 years doing this.
Yeah, you
and
have to listen
finding
to yourself
passion
about that.
is really important.
Yeah. To know, well, what I tell folks is basically make sure you're keeping an eye on your real goals, like whatever that is. If you know that you're going to be doing research for the next 20, 30, 40 years, make sure it's something you're interested in. If you know that you're going to be, moving on and doing something else in industry or working in some other way, make sure you're figuring out how to get to that goal. Whatever your real goal is, keep that in mind, because so many people, they approach school in this nose to the grindstone, head down, just keep moving forward kind of mentality. And it's important to look up and look around and figure out where you want to go, because you're going to get there one way or the other. You just might not like where you are if you don't plan and you're not intentional about it.
Right. And just something I know that you are all about the dissertation. So the ABD, everything but.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew someone when I was in graduate school who was at that stage, and I don't even know if she ever did finish, but I feel like you do all this work and all you have to do is write that dissertation at the end, like just, put the cherry on top, because, but the thing is, it can be so hard if what you've been doing has really not floated your boat, if you've really felt dragged down by it. And so that's where I think it is, even though I do agree with you, having the eye on the prize, really important, but also to have some joy in it, I think is also really key, because the motivation to get through the writing process can be really hard.
It can be difficult for folks. And a lot of folks complain about, guidance and direction and accountability and things like that. Those are things that in a lot of dissertation programs, they're just completely gone. It's up to you. You create something that's worthy. We'll give you the seal of approval. You don't, we don't care. So that's difficult for a lot of students as well. But yes, the motivation keeps you moving through that process. Now, when we were talking a little bit earlier, I definitely want to talk about the books, but you mentioned you had done the TEDx talk a while back, and that was an interesting experience too. Tell us about how that came about and how it was a little different than what you thought it was going to be.
Okay, great. Yeah. So this was actually the hardest thing that I think I've ever done, certainly as an adult.
This is someone with a Ph.D.
Yeah, it was harder. It was shorter than that, but it was harder than that.
Wow. Okay.
But so what this was actually, so as a function of doing these books, and my most recent one had come out, Why You Eat What You Eat, I get interviewed by NPR a lot, which is great, because NPR, a lot of people who buy books listen to NPR, and a lot of people who are interested in sort of intellectual pursuits listen to NPR. And someone had heard me on NPR, and they thought, oh, that she would be a great person for our TEDx division, which is in native Massachusetts. And so they called me up and they said, would you be interested? And I said, sure. This was like a life goal dream to do a TED Talk, actually. But they were very, very strict and serious about it. And I had to audition. So it was just because this one guy said, would you like to do this? And I said, yes, didn't mean it was happening. And I auditioned in front of about 8 people or so. And then they had their meeting. And then they decided I was okay, that they could go forward with me. But it wasn't just like, okay, you're going to do a talk on whatever, see you in a few months. It was this extremely serious, rigorous experience where I was paired up with both an academic and an acting coach, first of all. Then I had to work out what my entire talk was going to be. And it was 18 minutes of speaking. And I was going to be talking about all different kinds of things. And I went to one version, they're like, no, this isn't good. And I thought also learning how to write popular science is taking complex topics and then being able to translate them into digestible, easy to understand ways. And I thought I could do that. So then I have, my talk is prepared, like, no, we don't like this, or they take that out, or, so there was a lot of defeat experience doing it. And then there was the acting part of it. I think, I can give talks. I mean, I've given hundreds of talks, to all different kinds of audiences. You don't have to tell me how to give a talk. Well, no, the TED thing is really, really serious. On top of that, I don't know if anyone knows that red circle. That red circle is really important. You can't step out of the red circle, by the way.
Yeah.
And there was, while I was doing this, just to sort of ease the pain, there's this spoof of a TED Talk that was on YouTube that was absolutely hilarious that I would watch again and again and again to make myself feel better, because I was like really getting to the point of, why in the world did I say yes to this? This is awful. And I'm doing nothing but spending all my time on this. So let me just say that this started in October and the TED Talk was at the end of January. Where the real work started, where it really started getting serious, was the end of December. And basically all of January until the talk, my life was nothing but preparing for this. And what I had to do was both memorize and act out 18 minutes. And I was told, when I was doing the acting, oh, you can't do grapevines. Like, what are you talking about doing a grapevine? Like, I'm walking across the stage doing this. Oh, and the way you stand, it's actually called a sit. Like, you can't stand like this. You have to, like, all kinds of crazy things that you don't even know you're doing. Right. Like, someone watching you and go, by the way, when you do X, don't do this. So it's like unlearning all these basically instinct habits that you've had for your whole life, plus this memorization, and memorizing with like acting attitude and like really exaggerating all kinds of things that feel really stupid to exaggerate. And the analogy I make is like, if you've ever been made up for stage or being on screen, they put tons of makeup on you.
Right.
And you look at yourself in the mirror and you think you look ridiculous, but on camera it looks normal. Like, that was the whole idea with this super overacting out everything that you're going to be saying. Anyway, but I thought this memorization part was really what got me, because I hadn't done more than memorize a shopping list since I was, in grade 6 or something.
And we don't even have to do that anymore.
Yeah. I'm like, how in the world? And so I would try it. I'm doing all these acting techniques. I tried like doing, a memorization palace and writing notes and anyway, none of this was really working all that well. And I went to my dermatologist, for an annual, and I'm telling her about this. I'm so excited, but this is like the worst thing ever. And her assistant was in the office and she said, if you want to be able to memorize something, make it like a song and listen and tape yourself like kind of singing the song and then repeat along with it like you're singing a song like you'd listen to on the radio, and listen to it again and again and again, and like sing or say the words along with it until you can do the whole song by yourself. And that is literally what I did. Like, I would be walking my dog, listening to the song. Actually, my dog used to run out of the room when I would then be at home, like doing this rehearsal, and she's like, oh no, there she goes, the crazy lady starting again, and she'd bolt out of the room. But anyway, that actually miraculously really worked. And, but it was like an all-consuming experience, and it was extremely, extremely rewarding. But like I said, it was really difficult. And, afterwards, people said, you do it.
It's multimodal learning, right? You're learning this level, and then you're putting this texture on top of it. And then presumably, did they give you strict blocking for the TED Talk, like physical actions as well? Because that's another thing that often punctuates it. I remember, gosh, what was it? It was some silly little thing. My daughter was getting ready for her final, like the state final test in math. And I don't remember exactly what it was. It was something about adding fractions or something. And there was some point that she kept forgetting. And so I stressed, you have to do it like this. And when she started doing, this is the second step, she would remember it. She would never forget it at that point. But we did that over and over again. It's just like this. And I don't remember what the thing was, but it was something about adding fractions. So it was checking to see if the things were the same or something like that. But yeah, that's what it was. Oh, so it was when you're looking at fractions, if you want to add two fractions, you to figure out what you multiply by, because you can always multiply by 1. To figure out what you multiply by, you look at the other side. You take the two fractions, you go look at the other one, that's what you multiply by, so that you can start adding them together. And so that's what we always said, is you look at the other side. And once we started doing that thing, she got it. Before that, she kept forgetting it, and she would want to multiply by the thing that was on the bottom of the fraction she was looking at. It's like, that's not going to help you. But that explaining didn't do it. It was almost pounding it into her head, like figuratively pounding it into her head. Would look at the other side is what got it. So really interesting the way memory works, and the little things you can do to trick yourself into remembering.
I didn't have any of those, I didn't have any of those physical cues to sort of remind myself, but I definitely had, I was schooled on move your arm like this, don't move your arm like that, like, express this way over here.
When you do move, here's how you can move. You can move any way you want to, as long as it's this way, right?
Yeah.
Henry Ford, you can have any color you want as long as it's black, right?
And make sure to stay in that red circle.
Right. Yeah, so I know that I've known that for a while. I know people do that. I wonder how different that experience would be if they didn't do that, if they let them move around. Because I've seen so many really, really good TED Talks, but they're literally constrained to this circle. They do that for production reasons, right? Like they just don't have enough cameras to follow people around, basically, right?
I think so, and also probably for consistency. I mean, I think since that's sort of become the emblem, and that circle is a kind of a TED logo, so you're kind of like always in the logo. And I think if they had too much latitude of people wandering here and there, it would lose its sort of font style, as it were. Because I think that there's sort of a TED consistency that they try to maintain.
Yeah.
So it's probably why. But I mean, it is. You guys should look up this spoof version of a TED Talk, because it's really what it's all about, kind of in a way that
sounds like fun. Now, so here's the $1 million question. Knowing what you know now, would you do it again?
Definitely. And the thing is that, you mean the TED Talk or everything?
Right. Yeah.
The TED Talk?
Right.
Well, so that was actually what I was asked right after I did it. And I'm on this complete high, like, oh, that was so great. People coming up to me and I'm like, oh, like I'm a movie star, for 5 seconds. And then but at that time, I probably would do it again now, having sort of this experience, but I don't know that, it would really depend on what was also going on in my life, because I'm knowing the kind of sacrifice that's involved with respect to the time commitment and everything. I did not anticipate it being the time commitment that it was at all. And actually, I should tell you, funnily enough, one of the speakers that day was a Nobel laureate, a physicist, and he refused to come to any of the rehearsals or anything like this. And he said, been there, done that. And the organizers were really worried that he was going to be like the worst talk of all. He ended up being really good. I mean, he happened to naturally just be good at this, but they were in fact really concerned, because the sort of attitude of people who, oh yeah, no, I'm above this, the sort of Nobel laureate, it's not even wrong kind of idea, that they were concerned that he was going to be a total failure. But he, in this case, wasn't. But I think that the practice that is involved, to get to Carnegie Hall was really, really hard, and depends on what I was doing. But I would love it, if I was asked to do a real TED, like a full TED, no X beside it, I would definitely say yes. Another X, I don't know, that would depend on what I was going on at the time.
Yeah, it's like you're saying with the guy who didn't come to practice. It's tough, because a lot of professors say that it's my job. I profess. I do this all the time. How many of your students are asleep in your class every day? Let's get some data here, because a lot of professors they know that they talk, and they think they can do it. And it's amazing how everything can be studied, and you can learn everything. These people who were telling you these little things and had names for everything that you didn't even realize you were doing.
Right.
They studied that. There's like a whole body of study that's gone into that. And it's amazing how there's just knowledge is such a rich thing that you can dive so deep into anything. I think that's one of the reasons why I like talking to folks like you and the doctoral students I work with and everything, is because you can always learn something new anywhere, even in the most mundane things. Oh, you shouldn't stand that way. Why?
Right. Yeah.
Well, it's called this, and here's the reasons, the 5 reasons why. Like, there's 5?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's amazing, right? So I know you said you love writing, and a big segment of our audience, that's really what they're here for, is to get their book out there into the public domain and to help other people through their message. Tell us how that experience has worked for you, what it was like to the first time and after that.
So the first time, as I mentioned, I thought I was leaving academia. I thought this was the end, and I felt like after all this work, I can't just walk away and
right,
close the door. So I felt like I had to write a book, and this was also when I first started. This was 2004. The publishing industry, by the way, for popular science is very different today than it was then. But I was able to find an agent. I actually went through a couple before I found the right one. And that's also something people don't realize. I mean, at that time too, there was no self-publishing. So you had to get an agent if you wanted to be in a popular press. And also that, it's not like an agent's there and it'll all work out and everything's fine. Like the first agent had a totally different idea. Like she wanted me to write The Sense of Smell for Dummies. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm doing. The second one, had this other, like we just, didn't quite fit together. And then she didn't really have the connections. And finally I hit the right one. And I've been with this agent and her or partner for now, ever since 2004. But in any case, the translating, this was the first time I ever did it, science into a story was something that I did not know how to do. And I never went to school to learn how to do this, and nobody ever taught me. But I have always loved writing in general. Like when my first academic job was in Philadelphia, and I took creative writing like as a nighttime fun course. And when I was younger, I used to write like long short stories all the time, write poems. So I always really liked that, sort of creativity. But to put that into science wasn't something that I had ever any experience with or really knowledge how to do. And I read a lot of, popular science books to sort of see what would be sort of narrative nonfiction would be like, or so I sort of learned from reading. And I think that's actually really important. So reading other authors, and when you find someone who's writing you like, and then seeing what is it that they're doing. I mean, one of the problems with being a writer is sort of trying not to see mechanism, because now that I am a writer and I kind of understand certain devices that writers will use, and it's hard to sort of don't look at the fact that the author is doing this, just enjoy it for what it is. And like, it's like if you're a wine expert, it's like, don't think smells like caramel and wet dog, just enjoy the Chardonnay.
I tell my son all the time, he's 15, and he wants to point out all the little things about the movie. I'm like, I'm just trying to watch a movie. and I went through that stage in life too, where I was like, I'm smarter than this person. I can pick apart what they did. But at some point I'm like, he made a movie. He went through a lot of work to let me enjoy myself. Let me just enjoy myself instead of analyzing it all.
Right. Yeah. So for the most part, I've gotten good at like dropping that and not, when I'm reading for pleasure, which by the way, my major form of reading for pleasure is fiction. And I love murder mysteries. Like that's mystery is where I go.
Yeah.
But so I don't read popular science for fun. I don't read my books for fun, but I want other people to read my books for fun. But anyhow, so trying to figure out how to turn, complex science into narrative, enjoyable, easily understandable was a real challenge. And also because I knew this topic so well and everything about it was like completely interesting to me, I knew that that's not the case of everybody who's going to read this. So figuring out what's really important to say and other stuff to not say, and also how to turn this into something that's really enjoyable and digestible. And you can also, it's not like a textbook where first we teach you this, and then we teach you that it's like this, and then we teach you, well, it's not really like that. It's like, so that's not how you write it at all. It's like you start in the middle, then you go to the end, then you go to the beginning in terms of the topic, evolution kind of thing. So all those were real challenges for the first book in terms of paring it down, trying to figure out what else was interesting, finding a voice. That was something that was really hard too. Like, what is my voice specifically? Like, who am I, the speaker to the reader? And that's something that I've honed and has developed along the way. So I don't think I had it perfectly for my first book. I think my most recent book, I really got it much more, but it's something is also quite elusive. I don't even really know it. And people will come up to me and they'll tell me that they think I'm really funny. And I'm like, really? It's like, if I were trying to be funny, I would not be funny at all. So it's like, sort of, you don't want to try too hard, whatever it is that you kind of got, but sort of learning what your voice is. And basically it's like, if you were telling somebody else who you wanted to have them be interested in what you're doing, how would you explain it to them? Right. And just sort of, how would you talk it through? But something else that's a sort of a kind of a technique of mine, and just kind of came up with it on my own, or this is how it is for me when I'm writing, is it's really architectural for me. Right. Like the book is, and so my first book was all about the challenge there was paring it down, translating it into, popular science, etc. My second book, which was about the emotion of disgust, was a lot easier from the point of view of, I didn't really know that much about it to start with. I knew a little bit, but I know what would be interesting because I would be interested in it. Yeah. But I didn't know the topic. So I basically had to give myself a new PhD on the emotion of disgust. So that was a huge amount of work. And then my most recent book, Why You Eat What You Eat, I was at the point after a year into the contract, and I had a year left to go, of waking up in a cold sweat at 4 a.m., not having written a word, and thinking, I'm going to have to give back my advance. I cannot write this book. Yeah. Because I couldn't. It was like Fort Knox, that was the architecture at the time, and I'm standing outside, I cannot get in, because I kept thinking, anyone can write this book. Any journalist could write this book about food and eating. Why would I write it? And believe it or not, it had not dawned on me that someone with an expertise in smell and taste could actually have some particular in the topic of food and eating. And then it was like, oh, wait a second, I know how to approach it that's unique or different. And anyway, but that was the first architectural hurdle. Was I was standing outside Fort Knox. And then something that's the case for all the books is like, first of all, the internal plan. So the kitchen, is it next to the dining room? Is it next to the first floor bedroom? And then what's in the kitchen? You know, maybe I have this in there, but maybe I'm going to put that table into the dining room instead. So the content of each chapters, first of all, what's in one chapter, what follows from that chapter, what is actually in that chapter that you may actually think, well, something in chapter 1 really should go in chapter 4. So, you know, that whole sort of idea, the manipulation of the sort of segments within is very much of an architectural thing for me. And then also the idea of telling a story, both, you know, telling a story sort of, I like to use, you know, a lot of personal anecdotes as examples in the story, but also seeing the whole thing in a way as a story, I think is really important from the point of view of getting a reader involved. It's kind of, it's a difficult thing, but
well, it is, because that's how we emotionally react to stories. That's how we've been taught to learn for eons. Maybe not technically eons, but as long as humans have been around, at least, that's how we've been taught to learn. And so that's one of the things we have to teach our authors as well. Is you know, you've been again drilled into your head that you write a certain way, and it's very you know, stodgy and analytical and objective and cold, and nobody wants to read that stuff. So what you've got to do is become warm and engaging and use stories. And that can be hard for some folks to make that transition.
Well, you know what you said before about your writing when you first started writing academic papers and not wanting to make it this sort of third person, really wonky. Well, I cannot at the same time write, like if I'm writing a publication paper for an academic journal, I cannot do that. Well, actually, it's more that I can't be writing popular science at the same time as doing that, because that's like this totally, you know, formulaic writing style, and I don't want it hurting my narrative style. I can switch from writing the narrative to, okay, I have to work on a paper, because it's easy to kind of switch into that very methodological mode. But if I'm writing a lot like that, I cannot make that transition into the narrative, because it's like, you know, total brain switch. They really are different. And
it's like trying to play classical with one hand and jazz with the other. They're not. It's tough.
Yeah,
so you can do it, flip in and out, but it is definitely a different mindset, and you have to decide which way you're going to be writing. What's the point of what I'm writing? And for a lot of folks, they were so indoctrinated, obviously, in their doctoral degree program to write a certain way. That it takes us a while to break them and get them back out to being a person, so to speak. Not that researchers aren't people too, but
it's a different way of thinking. That's
yeah. I always loved the commercials that put at the bottom of the a little disclaimer: real people, not actors. Like, actors, you have a psychology degree. What does that do to actors? Do this. But anyway, well, this has been so interesting. Do you have an opportunity, or are you allowed at all to give us a sneak peek as to what's coming with the next book, or is that still under wraps as of yet?
Well, just because I'm sort of superstitious, like I don't want it to not happen. So if I don't really want to go there yet, but hopefully, you know, I'll hear some good news. I mean, like I said, the publishing world is really different today. And one of the things that has been a kind of a shock to me, actually, since the most recent book came out, Why You Eat What You Eat, I actually have tried already with 2 other books that so far that were not successful so far. They're still in the desk drawer. But one of them, I mean, this was really surprising to me, because a lot of people that were interviewing me after Why You Eat What You Eat came out said, you know, this would be so great. Kids need to know about food and eating, and they need to know how their senses and their psychology are involved. And you really should write a book for kids. So I thought that would be great. You know, I would love to do that. So I actually wrote out a whole, you know, book for kids, you know, template and everything. My agent was super excited about it. I actually had some really good feedback from Scholastic, and an editor there loved it when I thought that would be amazing. But then they took it to, they have their book fair marketing people, and they thought, oh, you know, they didn't really think it was going to work. So that was done with. And then during this past year of the pandemic, I had another idea for a book, and I think the pandemic really changed also how editors were looking at, marketability and everything else. And my agent was telling me a lot of things that normally are being sold are not being sold. So that's that other idea for a book, which was something different than the food book. I'm not going to say what that is, because hopefully maybe that will work out one day. But that got rejected, and I'm like, what? We were both like, how can this? Not that how can this be? But the topic, I thought, was something that people would really be interested in. So I guess I'm a little gun shy, because that had not happened to me with my first 3 books. It wasn't like, oh no. I mean, it was just which publishing house am I going to go with? Yeah. It wasn't nobody's interested in you. And now I had two total rejections, and thinking that, well, I don't want to say that this is a done deal yet, but I mean, this is also really interesting times, because as a function of the pandemic and just global finances and what are people interested in, what do people want to be reading about? It's not the same as it was even just a few years ago, let alone what it was like 15 years ago. So, for that reason, I'm a little, don't want to
I get it.
Too definitive right now.
I think 2020 is going to change a lot of things for a lot of industries moving forward in ways that we don't even begin to understand yet. I'm going to be very interested in seeing what people who are really studying this stuff have to say about how this affects our kids 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Because I guarantee you, they're going to be making decisions based on something they learned this year, this experience. So, but anyway. Listen, Dr. Herz, I've had a wonderful time. I know that you've got to go soon. I'd like to make sure that folks can reach out to you if they would like to make contact and maybe continue this discussion in any way. What's the best way for them to do that? Well,
the best way is my website. Okay. So you can find me. There's contact. My email's up there, and also you could follow me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. I don't know if anyone's professionally, into that, but I also have a blog on Psychology Today, although I'm not as good at keeping up with that as I should be. But I do have stories in there. But if you want to get in touch with me directly, my website and my email from my website would be the best way.
Great. And tell everybody, what's the website?
It's my name, rachelherz.com.
Easy enough. So, and folks who want to, if you're driving in the car right now or something, and you can go back to our blog on dissertationdone.com/blog, find Dr. Herz episodes there, and we'll link all of our contact information in, also the books, all the cool stuff, so that you can find it in one place. So we'll be happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strickland. It's been awesome. A pleasure and an honor to be on today.
Well, you are quite welcome. I very much appreciate this. We've had a wonderful discussion today. I do want to just remind folks briefly that today's episode has been brought to you by Dissertation Done. So if you are struggling through the dissertation process or about to face it, get the guidance and support and accountability that you need. Reach out to us at dissertationdone.com/done and see if we might be a good fit there. And if you would like to see if you can become a published author, just like Dr. Herz, maybe we can help you with that too. You can find out more at dissertationdone.com/book. And so we'd love to help you or have a conversation at least, if either of those two things is of interest to you. Again, Dr. Herz, thank you so much for being here. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a wonderful time too.
And for everyone else, have a great day and go out and live your unconventional life.
This has been An Unconventional Life. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe now to keep getting inspirational stories of unconventional lives as soon as they're released. Until then, go out and live your best unconventional life.